Hello, this is the second video where we're setting up our display, and where we ended in our last video, looks like I have a mistake here, so let's see if it solves it. Oh, there we go. We ended up in our last video with this, where we built our frame, but we hadn't put anything in it. So what we're essentially going to do now is, if you go back to that original picture we had, let me pull that up. This is the picture I want. We have basically the blue is our panel, and what we're going to do is build that panel, and we're going to put all these different widgets on the panel and then put that panel inside our frame. Now you'll notice here I've kind of drawn some lines, and I'll explain this shortly, but let's for now just kind of minimize this picture and let's construct our panel. So panel equals new JPanel, and then what I'm essentially going to do, and I'll do this now, is I'm going to say frame.add panel. Now when I run this, it's not going to look any different because the panel's on there, but there's no content on the panel. So what I need to do now is I need to set the panel up. And what that means is I need to take the panel and put all those elements on it, and then I'm going to put the panel on the frame. And that brings us back to this picture here. So this picture is a way of helping us visualize a setup. So there's lots of different ways to or pre-built tools to help us with putting widgets on. And I'm going to use one called GridBag, GridBag Layout Manager. I'm going to use GridBag Layout Manager partly because it's a really flexible layout manager to use, but also because it's a nice way to reinforce our understanding of classes. There's a lot of calls you have to make, and you really have to kind of be comfortable with using instance methods and accessing fields and things like that. So I really like it for that reason, especially at this point in our development. But to use it, you need to take your picture and you need to kind of get a lay of the land. So what I did was I took this picture, and between every element horizontally, I drew a line, and between every element vertically, I drew a line. That's those lines there. And what you end up doing is chopping up your display, and sometimes you end up chopping through elements, but this is what informs the location and some of the other parameters that are going to inform how we add this element to the panel. So the top left corner is 0, 0, x, y, and that's 0, 1, 0, 2, 0, 3, 0, 4, 0, 5, 1, 0, 1, 1, 1, 2, 1, 3, 1, 4, 1, 5, and you get the idea. Now you notice some of these elements sit perfectly inside a box, so that the labels all fit nicely. Some of the boxes are empty, but some of them actually span across more than one space, and that's the button. You see the button actually has a width of 2 columns and a height of two rows. And that's where we kind of use this thing called the GridBag Layout Manager to help manage that. So why don't I show you how this works. So the first thing I do is I'm going to do panel.setLayoutManager. Set layout, and I'm going to say new GridBag layout. So what I'm essentially doing here is I'm saying that whenever anything's added to the panel, I want you to use this specific layout manager. And again, there's lots of them, so go online and type in layout managers Java. So the first thing I want to do is I want to add the buttons and labels. So to do this, remember how we set these up as an array. What we can do now is we can use this nice loop structure to go through the array and add them in sequence. So for int I equals 0, I is less than text fields dot length. And if you noticed before, I had to do a retake, but I made a spelling mistake up here. This is text fields, just double check that. I is equal to I plus 1. And so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to actually construct the actual text field. So text field at I equals new JText field. And the constructor takes no parameters. So next, what I do is eventually I'm going to say panel.add. I'm going to add the text field at I, but what I need to do is give it what are called GridBag constraints. And so I have to create this, what's called a GridBag constraint object, which stores all the information about how to add this into the panel. So to do this, I make what's called a GridBag constraint object. And we're going to call this C1. New GridBag constraints. And now if I just type in C1 dot, GridBag constraints has all of these fields. And these fields are what kind of give information about how to add this element to the screen. Now, interestingly, this class isn't encapsulated. Now, why the designers chose that, I'm not sure, but it's a nice thing to kind of highlight because we've talked about you always encapsulate your classes. And you can see we've done that here. We've encapsulated by making them all private. So, we're going to go C1 dot gridx. So that basically sets our x position. And if we go back to this image, right there, we see that the x position is going to be always 1. So you see here how it's always 1 because all the text fields are in the x position of 1. And C1.gridY. And now, if you take a look at this picture again, the y changes, but the y is changing with respect to the counter. So we're going to set the grid y to I. And now, there's a nice little one called C1 dot, actually that's all I want to do. So then once I've done this, then I add the text field, that should be text fields.c1. And now, all those text fields have been added to the panel. So if I save this and give it a run, takes a bit to load, there it is. But these text fields are all really, really small. So they've been added and there's nothing else around it, but they're really small. So what I can do now is I can use this nice instance method, which is called set preferred dimensions. So I'm going to say text fields at I dot set preferred dimensions. And we're going to set the dimensions to 300 by 30. This is the number of pixels in terms of size. Spelling this wrong. Set preferred. Let me try and type this out again. Text fields at I dot set. There it is. Preferred dimensions. And our preferred size is going to be 300 pixels in width and 30 pixels in height. But, oh, this is my mistake. The parameters for this is where my mistake is. The parameters for this is it takes what's called a dimension object. So I'm going to say new dimension, and I'm going to say 300 by 30. So we have to import this. And so what I've done now is I've created this. I've kind of set the preferred dimensions of this text field to be 300 by 30. So if I save this and run this now, we just have to wait. There it is. We pull it on screen now. There they are. Those are our text fields. Perfect. So the other thing I need to do inside this loop is I need to take these labels and I need to place them. So again, if we come back to this image, the labels all have an x, grid x of 0, and then I can use the y to be the I again. So I'm going to make another GridBag constraints. C2 equals new GridBag constraints. And I'm going to say C2 dot grid x, and grid x is going to be 0, C2 dot grid y, and now grid y is going to be I. And then I do the same thing. I do panel dot add, and I'm going to add the labels at I dot C2. So I save this, and I run this. And I drag this down. Look at that there. I have my labels now, and I have this. Now, I want my labels to be tight up against this, so I can play around with the GridBag constraints here. There's a bunch of things I can do, but there's a nice one here called C2.anchor, and I'm going to anchor it to, and there's a built-in constant in the GridBag class, GridBag constraints, and it's called east. So, again, one of the things I want you to take away from this is learning how to read the code. So this is a constant because it's capitalized. Java always capitalizes its constants, or what we say is finals. And I know it's a static constant because I'm calling it with the name of the class. So if I run this now, let me just give it a second. Oh, so what happened here? Let's try and figure this out. Okay, I figured out what was wrong. This is a new. So let me just run this and I'll show you. It's not that the code was wrong, it has to do with something we'll fix shortly. Is that if I drag this in, and let me pull this in, notice when I shrink the size of the screen, it's constantly redrawing it. So the dimensions were set so that if it can't draw the dimensions, it just shrinks them. So there we go. So there's our anchored east, and we're good to go. So our next thing we want to do is we want to add the button, and we want to add the two other elements here. And then we'll wrap up this video. So let's take a look at this image again. And let's start with the button. So notice the button, the top left corner is 0, 4, and then it spans two columns and spans 2 rows. So all I do here is we're going to make a new GridBag constraints. GridBag constraints. We'll call this C3 equals new GridBag constraints. Notice that I'm doing this outside of the loop. And the reason I'm doing that is because there's only one button to add. And I'm going to say C3.gridX equals 0, C3.gridY equals 4, and then C3.grid width is 2, C3.grid height is 2, and then C3.fill. This is a nice one to use, and I'm going to do fill, and I can do GridBag constraints. Again, I'm going to call a static constant, both. And this is a nice one because what it does, GridBag constraints, there we go. It will actually enlarge the button to fill the entire space. So then I say panel.add, and I'm going to add submit C3. And let's just give this a run. Hit OK. Let's enlarge this. And there's our button. It's nice. And now what I want to do is I want to add if we go back to here, so I want to add this sort entry so it's position 2, 4. So I'm going to say GridBag constraints C4 equals new GridBag constraints C4.gridX is equal to, and what was it again? 2. C4.gridY equals 4. And then we say panel.add. And now what are we adding here? Now you'll notice at the start that I put the sort entry inside this array, so it's going to be labels at 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. It's going to be labels at 4.c4. So I'm going to add that. And so if I run this, let's just make sure this is working. It takes a second to load up. So there's my sort entry. So now we're going to add the last one, GridBag constraints C5 equals new GridBag constraints. And I'm going to pop open this, and I see this is 2, 5. So I'm going to say C5.gridX equals 2, C5.gridY equals 5, and then now I just have to add it in. So we come up, what's the name of our button? Called sorted. So I'm going to say panel.add sorted at comma C5. Give this a run. So there we have our button now. We can click, we can turn it on or off. We can put our entries in, we can hit the submit button. Now the last thing we'll do here is you'll notice how I have to resize this every time. That's a bit of a pain. So we can actually tell, before, once we put the panel in, we can say frame dot pack. And so what this is going to do is once we've added the panel to the frame, actually we have to do this after, this will actually size the frame to fit. This is a nice little touch here. So if we run this, okay. And now we get this nice kind of sized example. And you can play around with this by doing some different parameters around the GridBag constraints. And the last thing I want to do is, I don't want the person to be able to resize this. So I'm going to say frame.resizable, or is it set resizable? Set resizable, there we go, set resizable to false. So this is a set method that I can apply to the frame, and it just means that when I run this now, now the frame pops up properly and I can't resize it. So I hope this video helped. In our next video, we're going to create the employee class, which is going to actually store all the information. So this is going to be the data class. Hope this helped. Have a great day.